Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our Governance Made Easy webinar today titled Risk is a Strategic Board Conversation. My name's Sean McDonald, and I'll be your moderator for the next 40-odd minutes. And firstly, thanks for attending today. We really appreciate the effort you've made to be here for our live webinar. And during the session, if you have any questions for our esteemed panelists, please use either the chat or the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen on the toolbar. We'll try and get through as many of the questions as we have time for. And finally, if you stay through till the end, which we of course hope you will do, and as is customary for our webinars, we have a special treat for you. By answering a really quick 1-minute survey at the end of the webinar, you'll go into the draw to win our beautiful gift hamper worth over $400. Now, for those not too familiar with Board Pro, we are a board portal or a board software provider that serve around 20,000 users around the globe, and we enable organizations to prepare for and run their board meetings more effectively with, you guessed it, clever software, with less time and deliver more impact and value for their organization. And as much as we are a board software provider or a portal, as some people call us, part of the wider mission, or part of our wider mission, is to make the fundamentals of governance free and easy to implement for all organizations, especially those with resource constraints. And these webinars that we put on are a great example of how we work to achieve that particular mission, or our core mission, I should say. So that's enough from me. Let me hand it over to our panelists, starting with Stephen Bowman, who will introduce himself. Over to you, Stephen.
Thank you, and welcome everyone from around the world. I've been working in this space of governance risk management ever since I was sort of late 20s, and in the last 20 years I've been advising organisations around the world. And a lot of what we discuss is some of the wisdom and the insights from some of the best minds in governance who happen to sit on the boards that we happen to have time to work with. So a lot of what we're doing is talking about very practical aspects of what actually works out there as told to us by directors, chairs, and senior executives. Thank you.
Over to you, David.
Yeah, hi, David Bartlett. Been partner at Resolve Consulting for 20 years this year. And yeah, really working with charities and not-for-profits, schools, churches, charities in the governance, leadership and financial management space. Very similar to Stephen in the background. And I tell people I collect stories. So lots and lots of stories, working with hundreds and hundreds of organizations.
Thanks, David, and good to have you with us. It's your first time with us on our Governance Made Easy webinars, so welcome.
Thank you.
And Brett, our illustrious co-founder and CEO of Board Pro, Brett Hurt, over to you, sir.
Thank you. So I'm a co-founder and have been running Board Pro as CEO for about 8 years now. So I've been an entrepreneur for about 15 years and enjoy growing high growth businesses. And I'm a little bit of a governance geek. So I kind of love this space. I can't help myself but to try and codify and simplify. And we have a lovely ethos in the business. We want to give a lot of value back into the community, and we get amply rewarded by a proportion of those people coming and buying our software. So kia ora koutou katoa, welcome everybody.
Thanks, everybody. So, Stephen, I shall pass the mantle to you, kind sir.
Why, thank you. Now, if you've got questions as we go through, put them in the chat as well too, and Sean will try and keep up with them. But the first thing I wanted to say here is, look, this whole notion about risk it starts with a mind shift. What do we actually understand as risk? And if you look at the definition of risk, you look at any of the major quality frameworks around that talk about risk, essentially risk is always defined as anything that gets in the way of us achieving our strategic objectives. So nowhere in those definitions is the yucky, nasty, horrible, hope this never happens stuff, be very scared of risk. Doesn't actually appear in the definitions, yet that is what most people think risk is about. Go on, next one. So one of the things that we know that when we've talked with many directors over the years, that there's often a point of view that risk is negative, that it's the potential for the loss, the potential for something that can go wrong. My favourite is when you ask a director, what do you think are our top 2 or 3 big risks? It's always a bit of a giveaway when their first reaction is, oh, fraud. Why? Because we see it in the news all the time. Yes, but how often does that actually happen? Well, not very often. And if it were to happen, what's its impact likely to be? Well, not pretty big. But so why is it a big risk? So they tend to not understand what risk actually is. And then when you drill down to the staff level, and we know this because they tell us risk is a pain in the neck. Risk is complicated. It's difficult. We've got all these systems in place to monitor it. We have 2 full-time people just filling in risk registers, that sort of thing. So what we want to do is to change the whole narrative around risk and look at it through the perspective that it should always have been, which is risk is the flip side of opportunity. Risk is understanding the key elements that are going to get in the way of us being able to achieve our vision, our purpose. And from that perspective, we can then start to look at risk as strategic opportunity and strategic advantage. And David and Brett and I have got many examples of where organisations have done that. So really, when we start to look at risk, rather than being concerned by it, we should be excited by it. Because if we understand our top 4 or 5 or 6 key risks, then by very definition, these are the things that are going to have an impact on our key strategies. And our key strategies are what we are creating the future about. And the role of the board is to create the future. So have a look at your key risks, the big ones, and understand that they're also the things that are going to go hand in hand and walk side by side with our key strategies. And if we can have that same mindset for risk as we do for strategic opportunity, then we're starting to really unlock the value of risk. David, I know you've got some thoughts in this area. Unmute.
You'd think after years I'd get this right. It's in the title itself. It's risk management, not risk elimination. And we see it all the time. And I don't want to pick on lawyers, but sometimes lawyers and accountants will seek to eliminate risk at all costs, but they forget that the management of risk is actually about identifying and responding so that we can both protect and create value. And that's a message that I think is sometimes lost, that we're here to protect the organization, but in the context of creating value for the organization. So management of risk is very different to what's in most people's heads. They do see it as almost like a compliance. We have to, minimize, and they get the protect part, but they forget the create value part.
Yeah, I'd love to see people take that word minimize and put leverage. Yes. How can we leverage this risk? I mean, one of the things that's really interesting is when you start to think about it, why is it that your organization can do what it does? And if you really boil it down, we can do what we do because we understand the risk and we manage it better than most others. So that's why we're able to deal with disability. We're able to deal with making widgets. We're able to deal with, schools and child safety, because we do it better than anyone else, because we understand and manage. But the forgotten part is the leveraging of those risks into different possibilities and different opportunities. And we'll show you how to do that in a little while.
And
Brett, anything you want to add to that?
Sorry, go Brett.
Yeah, I've got a live provocation for you, Stephen. I know you'll love it because you've seeded me with this idea we were saying earlier for a number of webinars over a couple of years. And I've been quietly mulling on it in the background. And we're guilty as an organization of the classic approach to risk. And we do, of course, as a cloud software business, manage cyber risk, all that sort of thing. But just in this moment, sitting here, I'm thinking, actually, the biggest risk in our business is we deploy a number of millions of dollars of capital every year to building enhancements in the software, improving the software. Probably the greatest business risk for our business is to actually not deploy that capital well and everything behind that. But I don't think we've ever put that. We do manage it, but it doesn't sit on the risk register. What would you recommend to me, Stephen?
Well, look to see how would we measure whether or not we're deploying it well. Now, if you could put those measurements in place, how can we leverage those measurements to enable us to look at other business opportunities that might arise as well? And if we're looking at the deployment of our capital, how do we know that it's actually creating value? Or maybe we should talk to our stakeholders. Maybe we should set up. Now, this is where it gets really exciting. How do we minimize the potential for us to not deploy our capital appropriately? Well, minimizing the potential, there's always two elements: minimize the potential, and the second one is minimize the impact. How do we minimize the potential for not deploying our capital? Okay, we'll have in place really solid policies that we monitor and that we check to see whether or not they're fit for purpose. We will always be asking the question, what are the other possibilities that we could be doing with this? Now, if you do find that you haven't deployed it appropriately, how can we minimize its impact? So what can we put in place to actually be able to move nimbly in some of those areas? What are our exit strategies for some of the things? How can we leverage those? So all of a sudden, it gives you a multifaceted look at something. If you look at it through the lens of potential to occur, and then impact if it does occur, what have we got in place to manage that? And then how can we leverage that into other opportunities every step of the way?
Stephen, I have a question from, sorry, I beat you to it, Brett. I have a question from Sharon Wingate. Our board has always had a risk, finance and audit committee, which I feel is an archaic approach as it's centered on financial risk only. Are more NFP boards adopting a separate approach, i.e. adopting a risk committee separate to a finance and audit committee?
Okay, let me reframe the question a little bit. If I have a finance committee that is strategically focused on the strategic implications of the finance and are looking at how to leverage the various elements of the financial reports, and they are leading the discussions with the board about the strategic implications for the next 3, 4, 5 years about what the finances are telling us, then they are ideal to also take on the risk portfolio, because they're strategically minded. They're actually looking into the future. If I have a finance committee that just gets a spit out report of MyOb or QuickBooks or whatever it might be, and they present that spit out report to the board, I don't want them touching risk because they're just operationally minded. So I haven't seen many organizations split risk out separately unless their finance committee is not doing its job properly. And then it makes sense. But the key thing is, if you've got people on your risk committee, they should be of strategic mindset rather than compliance mindset. Compliance is easy. We know how we're going to comply with these things. But taking it to the next level of, well, what are the opportunities? What are the revenue streams that this might generate for us? That takes a different mindset. So the best way to describe this is one of the best risk managers of an organization I've ever come across. He's absolutely brilliant. I said, what's your job description? He said, oh, it's really simple. I ask lots of questions. And I thought that was brilliant, because what he was doing, he was unpacking with the teams what they thought the risks were, what we could do to manage that risk, how we could leverage it, what might the business opportunities be. And because of that mindset, he was actually able to put that organization, it was a non-profit, put that organization in a space where they were actually kicking goals all over the place because of the opportunities they were willing to see and to manage. David, thoughts?
Yeah, I think one of the problems I've seen in a lot of organizations is we've quarantined risk into a separate category and disconnected it from strategy and from our strategic planning and from that process. And so by bringing those back together, I've got a few clients, not many though, that are actually saying we want to be innovative. Post-COVID, traditional strategic planning died, so we now agile planning is the go. So they're actually integrating risk as part of the strategic process rather than quarantining risk as a compliance function. And for me, and we'll talk about this later in this session, compliance is all about risk tolerance. What's the maximum amount of risk we can cope with? And that is the focus of almost every risk committee I've seen. But when you look at the risk framework and risk policy, you'll see a thing called risk appetite. That's the strategic part of risk. That's where you chase risk. You work out your appetite as an organization. what risk can we chase to achieve our purpose? What are the parameters we need to decide whether to pursue something or not? What are the policies, all the things Stephen's talked about? That's about our appetite. And if you take a proactive approach to risk where you say, I want to build a healthy appetite, have a healthy diet, eat the right things, look at risk the right way from an appetite point of view, rather than from a tolerance point of view only, you get the balance we're looking for. And at the moment, we're well and truly out of balance with so much focus on tolerance, not as much focus on appetite, in my view.
The best way I would describe risk appetite is a couple of comments. Number one is often it's overthought. Secondly, it gives guidance to the staff about what they should be bothering the board with. If we have a high appetite for risk in this area, then go for it. Bring it to us. Give us the opportunities. Give us the business cases in that. If we have no appetite for it, don't bother us with it. Just manage that. If there's no appetite for this, don't try and tell us that you want to do it if we've got no appetite for it. So exactly. It's a great way of keeping everyone focused on the big ticket items that are going to actually create great change.
Hey,
Brett, any thoughts?
Question, Stephen. So I think you're basically advocating that the risk strategy conversation should be more intrinsic in all the big decisions the board is making. It should just flow into the papers and the process for making decision, and it's just part of a holistic whole with a risk register, yeah?
Risk is just another filter. Like finance is a filter, and ethics is a filter. They're all filters. Risk is just a filter. So when we're looking at any new project coming up, I want to know what the risks are. Not to be scared by them, but that's just another way of looking at it. De Bono's seventh hat, for example. So I want to know the risk element of it, but also as part of that, I know I've got a really good executive team when not only do they talk about the risks, here's how we could manage them, but here are the opportunities that we could actually create when we do this really well. And if you want to go to the next step, here are the potential revenue opportunities that come from this as well too. But it's always been there. It's just that people don't have any attention on that side of things. So one of the things here is that risk management, I love this. I've seen this recently because one organisation we're dealing with, we're very proud they had 19 separate risk registers. Risk management is not risk registers. We've got 450 risks on our risk register. So what? Risk management is all about having a look at, in particular, what are our top 3 or 4 key risks, because the staff can look after the others, but what are these top 3 or 4 risks that are existential to us that if we nail them, will actually create unlimited doors of opportunity and possibility that come from it. And one of the things always I would say there is, please, start moving away from your risk registers and your risk reporting in Excel spreadsheets. Start to look at risk management software. There's some okay ones out there. Most of them are rubbish, but do your research in those areas. I've seen quite a number of organizations use something called Riskman. There's another one that is quite popular, but it's a bit clunky at times, which is CompliSpace, My Compliance. David, thoughts on risk management software?
I think scale to suit. I think if you're a small organization, there's nothing wrong with Excel. I think as you get larger and more complex, then you start to need to look at software. Just be careful, though, that in picking software, you're not creating a bureaucracy. The management of the software actually compromises good risk management in itself, because it turns it into a professional role for someone to be the risk officer so that everybody else forgets about risk. So that's the danger with software. It can really not help but hurt in this space.
One of the things that we'll give you at the end of this webinar is an Excel spreadsheet that actually, to me, is probably one of the best templates that we've used over many years, that looks at both the risk register, the risk treatment plan, and also the compliance breach register, because sometimes a risk occurs. I want to know what we learned from it. How do we manage it? How can we leverage the fact that this risk, some of the things occurred in this area? What have we learned? So you'll get that as part of the material that's sent out tomorrow. And it
Stephen, I
also
have
tests
another
the
question.
effectiveness of controls.
Have a question in from Mark, who says, risks management is an enabler to growth. Please provide an example of market capitalization increase only possible via great risk management.
David, do you want to do your Costco one?
I'm going to tell my Costco story. This is one that I was not associated with this decision, but it's a very smart decision where they looked at risk from a revenue generating and a strategic capital growth perspective. And it was a series of management within Costco we're talking about getting rid of the membership fee. When you're a member, when you go to a Costco, you've got to pay your annual membership fee. And once you've got your membership fee, you can go and shop at Costco. And the wisdom, as Costco was expanding and growing, the wisdom was, let's drop that because we're missing out on sales. We could grow so much faster. But what was missed was that was a revenue discussion. But the reality was that decision to put a membership fee in was actually a risk discussion that created a revenue advantage. And the reason it was a risk discussion is it came about because the kind of customer Costco wanted in its warehouse were customers that wouldn't be thieving and taking stuff. And so it was actually a shrinkage strategy to stop stock loss through walkouts and all those other things, making it a little bit harder to become a member of Costco. Actually brought a different type of customer into Costco. And so that actually is part of the fundamental success of their business model, and why they've just grown and grown and grown is because they took a risk issue and I believe turned it into an absolute distinguisher in the market and has created a really, really healthy business, an envious business.
Okay, so risk is always an ongoing conversation, not just compliance reporting. So bring up in your mind's eye a copy of the risk report that your board gets. Now, do they get a compliance report about here are our risks and look how many green arrows there are pointing up saying that we're better off, or here's a couple of red arrows and here's the change in our risk register? Is that what the risk report looks like? Or does it focus on the key risks, how we're managing those risks, how we're actually leveraging the fact that we're managing those risks, and how we're taking it to the next level to create value as part of what we're doing as an organisation? Two very different conversations based on whether we view risk as a compliance issue, and then we'll have a report that just says, yes, we're complying, versus a strategic issue, which is, so what are the opportunities that come from both managing the potential for this to occur and managing the impact if it were to occur? So a great example of that is in many organisations, one of their key risks is change in government policy, because they might be funded based on government policy. They might be overly reliant on government contracts. So one of the big risks should always be change in government policy. What's the potential for that to occur? I don't know. It depends what time it is. So how do we minimise the potential for that to occur? Okay, well, we need to know the politicians really well. We need to make sure that we're working both sides of the fence. We need to have really good relationships with the key politicians and the key bureaucrats in that area. We need to be seen as trusted friends in this area, rather than people that are going off at the mouth all the time. What can we do to minimise the potential for this to occur? And there's some very, very cool examples of organisations that have done this exceptionally well. Now, if it does occur, how do we minimise its impact? So what are the things that we could put in place? Well, we need to ensure that we're not going to be totally reliant on one source of funding. So let's expand out our funding. We need to ensure that our staff are going to be nimble enough so that they can move over to other elements of the business. Maybe we set up some agreements with other organisations that if we lose a major contract, then maybe we can do some joint activities with those organisations using some of our staff. All of a sudden, it unlocks all of these opportunities if you look through the lens of minimising the potential to occur, and then if it does occur, minimising the impact that it will have on the organisation, and start being creative about that. That is what's going to make your organisation stand out from anyone else. David?
Stephen,
I'll go, Sean.
Yeah, we have quite a few questions here lining up, so I just wanted to just pick on a few of them.
Can I just do a quickie before you do? A useful tool I found, because we're talking here about risk at a board level, not operational risk. I want to make that distinction, because at a board level, the board's the risk owner for the whole organisation risk, including strategic. There is a need for operational risk management, child protection, and a whole bunch of other things, so that we're not saying don't do compliance. But what we're saying is there's a useful little tool that you could just implement in your board. Whenever there's a new issue or strategic decision, have like an issue paper that has background to the issue, what the proposals are, what the various options were considered, and what are the identified risks, and what do we think we should do with those, and how should we avoid them? Should we try and manage them? Should we reduce them? Should we accept them? Like where and what insight is risk bringing into this? By just adding risk as part of the decision process, you're a good step towards what we're talking about today. Back to you, Sean.
That's a good segue into Rob's question. What's the best way to feed risk assessments into strategic goal setting and vice versa?
Well, that'd be one way I'd suggest.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, one of there's two elements to that. One of them always is when you're reviewing your strategic plan, or when you're developing up a new tranche of a strategic plan, a new 3-year or 4-year plan, then you do your strengths, you do your weaknesses, you do your opportunities, and don't call them threats, call them risks. So what are the risks? What are our big risks? What do we need to understand? And you also ask your key stakeholders, what do you see as our big risks? One of the biggest failings I find in many organisations is they don't actually check in with their stakeholders about what the key stakeholders think might be their big risks. Because if you understand that risk is also opportunity, what you're actually asking them is, what do you see as our big opportunities that are out there? So you can do it through your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, risk analysis, and also every strategic plan should have action plans that come underneath it for that particular strategy. And those action plans, by their very definition, have to have a start date, a finish date, an outcome measure, and also a risk analysis, and preferably also an ethical analysis for each one of those action plans. That means that if you identify as part of the action planning side of the strategic plan, what are the key risks, you can then build that back into the scoping mechanism to ensure that we not only identify those risks, but we put in place the things to manage their potential to occur and to manage their impact if they were to occur. And that makes that actual planning side of things so much more powerful.
I think the other part is capacity to take on a risk is often not done well in a strategic discussion. I'll use an example of a live story from a board I'm on, where a community radio station was deciding to put a newsroom in internally, not outsource it. It's a huge decision. So the idea of capacity, having a capacity conversation around risk, means you'll end up with decisions you wouldn't otherwise end up with. And in our case, we ended up with a decision that said, we're going to have a loss for the next 3 years, because we know this newsroom will come good after about 3 or 4 years, and the revenue will catch up, and it will build a fundamental piece of the foundations of the radio station. And it did, but that's a risk conversation, because having conversations around stakeholders around capacity and strategy. Capacity is often one that's missed. So boards that don't think about capacity, don't think beyond the 12-month budget, are missing out, I think, on an opportunity to stretch and be innovative and actually use risk as a tool to actually make a riskier decision in the confidence that you've managed all the various moving parts. And there's always the bottom drawer plan if it doesn't work, but that's part of a process of good risk management.
Brett?
Question for you again, Steve, and I've seen some of the questions are around practical outworkings and examples of this. I know you've got that spreadsheet at the very end. I'm just wondering live whether there's an opportunity for us to do a few worked examples in a later webinar or a later content offering. What's your thoughts,
What would
Stephen?
be very interesting if people were able to provide what they saw as their top 4 or 5 key risks, and then maybe their top 2 or 3 key operational risks, and we can work through the mindset. It's very simple to do, very simple to do, but having worked examples can be very powerful. Yeah, I often give, I won't do it here, but I often give the example of child safety, and in particular sporting organisations. You know, what are their 1 or 2 top big risks? And they're not particularly pleasant risks either. But then how do we then manage the potential for those to occur and the impact if they were to occur? And how can we leverage every step of the way so that we create opportunity from managing these risks really well, over and above just managing them? And
Brilliant.
that's
Yeah.
and it's that mindset that starts to turn risk into a strategic conversation, not just a unilateral conversation.
I'll circle back with Sean after today, and we'll look at whether we run a survey and flush out from our following community whether, and look at some worked examples.
Sean, can we move on to the next one? So the role of the board in all of this in terms of risk is to make sure that we not only have the systems in place both at the operational level, but we're also getting reports as a board about not only our top 3 or 4 or 5 key critical risks, but also any emerging risks that are coming through. And the key role of the board in this is to really create the atmosphere, the culture that risk is a strategic conversation, not just a compliance reporting function. Can you move on? Okay, so a couple of things that you can do. Very, very simple. Really simple. In your risk management plans, have another column in there that says strategic opportunities, just to remind people that it's not just about reporting against our risk register and here's the management plans, but also start to look outside of that. Have another column in there that says strategic opportunities. And then the next column, have one in there that says revenue possibilities. That starts to change the focus that people have. You know, how can we make money from this? How can we create extra asset utilization from this? How can we set up greater stakeholder engagement from this and maybe go for new contracts that we hadn't thought that we could possibly go for? You'll be amazed at what comes out just having that as a focus. So we've covered that one. We've talked about risk appetite. We've talked about that one. Okay, board committees that are in charge of risk. One of the biggest issues, and David alerted us to that before, if you've got just a risk committee, then the issue sometimes is it becomes a compliance reporting side of things. And probably 2/3 of all the risk committees I see, they don't focus on the most important part, which is what are the emerging risks that we need to start to look at now in advance of them actually occurring. How many of your boards or your risk committees have started to look at artificial intelligence as an emerging risk? How many of us have started to look at the changing nature of infrastructure and our operational components of our organisation as artificial intelligence is going to have an impact on that? That's an emerging risk. Fabulous opportunity, but if you look at it through the risk perspective, then you start to really unpack and do it in a logical way that it can actually help you get ready for what's going to happen anyway. One of the point number 6 there, you can read all these at a later date, but if you really want to make the point that risk is about strategic opportunity and advantage, have a KPI for your key performance indicator for your CEO that actually looks at some of the one of these key risks and actually creating both mitigation strategies or treatment strategies, but also looking at opportunities, and those opportunities to have to create X% increase in revenue for us might be one of the KPIs, just to make that point. So there's all sorts of different things that the board can do to actually help change the culture, but also get our reporting where it needs to be. Sean, next one. That's about annual review of key risks. Always be reviewing your risks, and in particular looking at emerging risks, but also having those key conversations. And this is often done through reporting.
With just a quick one on the annual review. something worth sharing is don't just use the standard, the ISO standard, or whatever you find on Google, set of categories for risk.
Yeah.
Customize your categories to suit your organization. So if you're a disability service provider, have a category around the issues really local to your kind of business. Or I know schools, and we do a lot of work in schools, child safety, not just people. People's a category. You can have like 5 or 6 categories, but no, I would reword the categories to really hone in on the core risk areas or spaces of your business. It's going to help you do risk so much better.
One of the insights in here is that also have a really good look at your risk reporting to the board, because if it's not helping the board have strategic conversations, and the risk reporting's useless. It's a compliance report rather than something that helps drive conversations. And it can be as simple as saying, look, here are our top 4 critical risks that we've agreed are our big fella risks. Here are the potential strategies for dealing with those risks, and here are the potential opportunities and leveraging that we can have if we're to do that. Now, here's where the revenue might be from these, or some sort of creating of greater asset classes in different areas. That's a board discussion, not just oh yeah, we've got a risk report. That's what we want to be focusing on. Okay, move on. Sean? Okay, so board chart. So here's a little checklist for you here. So in our board charter, do we mention risk, and do we say that risk is more than just a compliance issue? It is part of our strategic conversation. You may as well put it in your board charter that actually says risk is, and here's how we deal with risk, and this is our philosophy and view on risk. Board induction programs, rather than giving them just a risk register, I'd rather that they actually have a conversation with either the CEO or the chair of the risk committee about how we deal with risk around here. Here's how we look at risk. Here's some examples in the past of where we've used risk to create great opportunities for the organisations. Here are the questions we'd like you to consider around risk. Do it as part of your induction. Your board agenda. Okay, if you're going to get a risk report, make sure that it's actually tied in with both strategy and it's not just a standalone report against a risk register. Sorry, I can't see that other one. Board committees. Okay, if you've got a board committee and it's dealing with risk, whether it be finance audit risk, whether it be a separate risk, a clinical risk committee is slightly different again, but make sure that you got people on that committee that just aren't about compliance, that they're actually asking questions around all of this. They're looking at the leveraging side of it. And then in your annual report, why wouldn't you put in, here are our top 3 risks, here's how we're managing those risks, and here's some of the wins that we've had in these areas. Because again, it's the flip side of strategy. All right. Now, I don't expect you to read these, but I just wanted to go over some of the key things that can have a fundamental impact on how you actually view and report against risk. Now, there's three key elements to any sort of risk framework. The first is the risk register. So this is our risk library. Here are all the risks. Now, in here, we've got the category that we mentioned before, what the risk is, the potential for it to occur, the impact if it does, the quality of the controls that we've got around it, and then the list of the controls. So what have we got to actually manage the potential, to manage the impact, and what's the quality of these controls like? And then you can add them up, and risk software does this for you. And then according to our criteria, is this a critical risk? Is it a high risk? Is it a medium risk, a low risk? Whatever your criteria might be. And then the last time it was reviewed, when it should be reviewed next, and then who is the owner of that risk? Is it the board? Is it a particular element of the organisation? Who is the risk owner in that area? Now, the next element then is what are we going to do with it? The risk treatment plan. So here's the risk, here's its priority. Here are the various treatment options. Here's how we're going about treating them. Now, let's plan that out a little bit. Scope, resources, start date, finish date, who's in charge of it, How do we know if that we're managing this well? What are the ethical implications? What's the strategic opportunity for us in managing this risk? And what are the revenue possibilities as well? So those last two columns we've mentioned before, but in any risk treatment plan, it should be a plan. Here's what we're doing. Here's how we're going about it. Here's our outcome measure, whether or not it's been successful. And then a compliance breach register. I don't see too many organisations using this, but I want to know if we've had a near miss or if one of these risks has come to fruition, what are we doing about it? What is the impact of the breach? What have we learned from it? And this is just in a simple spreadsheet. Now, good risk management software will do this for you, but what I particularly wanted you to do was to have a look at those elements that are there, those key headings. A little segue in this one. I see a lot of organisations spend a lot of time analysing what the inherent risk is, and then after we've treated it, what is the residual risk. My personal point of view is I don't want to spend much time looking at inherent risk. I just want to know the residual risk. I just want to know, after we've treated this, is it still a highly critical risk? That's what I want to know about. I'm less interested in, was it a very high risk before we treated and now it's a low risk? I'm really not that particularly interested in that. I'm interested in what is the risk, and what is the residual risk that we've got after we treat it? Is it still really high? If so, we need to keep an eye on it. We need to really manage it, monitor it, report against it, continue to look at different ways that we can actually leverage and take this to the next level. David?
I think the degree to which you use inherent risk relates to the quantity of risks you're identifying and the legal requirements or other regulations that might be on your business. So inherent risk is useful where you do have quite a number of risks. You don't want to have to go down the road of thinking about controls and all those other discussions for all of them. So by establishing inherent risks with loads of green, you can still end up at the same place Stephen has ended up with, but keep the regulators happy or your own board happy around the comprehensiveness of a risk approach. So if you're looking to have a comprehensive approach, you will have a lot more risks identified operationally and organisationally, but the inherent part of that process can help you manage the volume of that really well, because you can move straight to the process Stephen's outlining, because a whole lot of those risks will already be inherently in the sort of yellow-green zone and not something you need to pay a lot of attention to.
So if I can just summarise, how do we turn risk into a strategic conversation? Well, it comes first of all with the mindset that it's possible. Secondly, it also comes with the reporting up to the board. So please don't waste the board's time with reporting against risk registers. If they're interested, they can always have a look at it, give them a link to it. But if you're doing a report, keep them focused on the strategic implications. Keep them focused on the potential opportunities. Ask for some of the innovative approaches to managing some of these risks that we may not have thought of as staff. Get them to think along those lines and make your reports to the board actually focus on those, rather than just to tick the box, yes, we've got risk under control sort of reporting. David, last thoughts?
My last thoughts are just to remind you that risk sits alongside strategy, and it also sits alongside compliance reporting. So compliance reporting is the big brother of risk, and there are very simple ways you can report compliance to your board that doesn't distract your board to only focus on compliance. Compliance is one of those proactive things. You should be reporting on it proactively so the board knows it's done. Then they've got the safety to know they can use agenda time to talk about the exciting stuff, talk about the strategic stuff.
And simple tools like a compliance schedule and a simple
Correct.
compliance report that has a dashboard. And again, software can help with that. But I want to see, for example, as a director, every 6 months, an attestation report from our senior executives that we are actually complying with all of the key regulatory and legislative compliance requirements and our key contract requirements. And we, as senior executives, attest that we are complying with them. That gives me some comfort that at least they've looked at it. Brett, thoughts? Last thoughts?
I think we're hard up against time here. Great work, team. I've really enjoyed participating, and sucking it up alongside you guys. So brilliant. Thank you.